Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our webinar about why a fair pricing framework is needed for APCs. First, I would like to contextualize this webinar a little bit. First, this fits in a broader set of actions that Coalition S is undertaking with our various partners on fairness and equity. Namely, you may have known about our initiatives together with Association of African Universities, IFO, International Science Council, Open Access 2020, Science Europe, and UNESCO, where we organize a number of workshops on practical mechanisms and action plans to remove barriers for readers and authors. You also probably know about the work that we are also currently undertaking on Diamond Open Access in order to make equity greater for authors and readers. And this also fits in that context, namely, how can we, as long as we have APCs, how can we make them more fair? Because I mean, APCs, some of us may not like them, or especially authors may not like them very much, but they are a very easy framework for both funders and for publishers to provide open access. But it's not, of course, because it's easy that it is the right way to do so. And certainly not one of the things that is striking for everyone, of course, is that the APC is a mechanism that is a single price for all. Namely a single price worldwide, which makes it a very strange kind of service, because if you compare that to other types of services, they are mostly priced as a function of the context in which the service is being offered. Take soft drinks, even medication, airline tickets, they're all priced differently according to the purchasing power of the country. And this is actually a question that came up in one of the seminars that we had with African countries some time ago, namely the request, do something about equity, do something about the equity of APCs, because, you know, as long as they are a problem for us in Africa. So is there something that could be devised to make those more fair? And of course, we see it at Coalition as our role to launch these kinds of discussion with publishers, with various stakeholders, librarians, and the research community, to see whether for the time being we can, and as long as APCs are around as a financing mechanism, which is still going to be for some time, we can try to make them more fair. And so one of the ideas was, why don't we do this in the way that this is done for medication? I know, for instance, I heard that this is done for medication as well worldwide. I mean, for medicine, we don't pay the same thing. So why would we pay the same price for APCs worldwide? And first of all, I would like to say, also as a kind of a disclaimer, this is not a policy by Coalition S, not a policy that we are trying to enforce. We are not a price regulator. It's very important to know that we are not a price regulator. The only thing that we are trying to do here is to launch a dialogue. We already saw a number of criticisms of this framework on social media, saying, well, this is not the right framework. Well, okay, but it's fine. I mean, you know, this doesn't have to be the right framework. It doesn't have to be the right proposal. This is an invitation to a dialogue first and foremost. And it's that dialogue that we want to work, namely, how can we make sure and how can we invite publishers to become more equitable in line with the UNESCO Declaration, because equity has become a big discussion, I think, in open access publishing in the last few years. How can we, in a dialogue with publishers, make sure that they begin to adopt more equitable pricing mechanisms in APC pricing? And that's what we're here for today. Okay, I'll give the floor back to Lorraine. That was longer than I had intended, but
that's okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start, I just want a few things about the housekeeping and how we will organize the webinar. We have divided the webinar into 3 parts, with pauses for discussion, for questions, and so on. In the first part, we will be talking about purchasing price parity and the purchasing price indices, and we'll stop and have some discussion. Then we will talk about the banding of countries into groups for differential pricing, and then at the end of that section, again, we will stop for questions and discussion. And finally, we will discuss risk sharing in respect of exchange rates. So that's the format that we're going to have. I'm joined by two colleagues, Herman Mentik and Dave Jago, and they've been very involved in this project, and they are here to answer your technical questions, which I'm sure you're going to have along the way. So as Johan said in his introduction, this is very much a discussion, very much a consultation. And we have spoken to librarians and library consortia in several countries and a wide range of publishers. And we're very grateful for those who've already shared their time and their insights with us. But this webinar is an opportunity to really broaden that out, to develop this discussion across a far wider stakeholder group. And I will remind you all at the end, but we have a survey running, and we really hope to get your feedback through this webinar, but also if you will participate in the survey at the end, that would be really fantastic. So as I say, we'll move straight into the first part of the webinar, which is about purchasing power parity. And this is a concept, and it's the concept around it being more equitable to charge different prices for the same goods and services based on factors varying by country. And as Johan says, this does happen already in the case of certain goods and certain services. And purchasing power parity is an important concept because current pricing practices in scholarly communication do not reflect local purchasing power. And so the objective of this project is to develop a fairer global pricing framework. And we seek to deliver inspiration for publishers to adopt more equitable approaches to pricing, and also to develop that discussion around that. In undertaking this project, we start with that concept of purchasing power parity. But in order to develop a framework that we can use for our discussion, we need some data. We need a numerical expression of the differences between countries. And it's very important for transparency that this framework is data-driven. And we use data that is independently calculated, that is reliable, objective, and most important of all, I think, that we use open data. In choosing the data that we're going to use, we are very mindful that most data sets include outliers that have unusual or unexpected values. And a few people have already on social media mentioned a couple of those. And we'll talk about those a little bit more, I hope, during the course of the webinar. But those outliers do, of course, need careful consideration. So we needed to choose a purchasing price index, a PPI, as they are called. And there are a number of these. It was quite eye-opening to me how many there are. And I've listed them all here. I won't read them out. And we evaluated those purchasing price indices in terms of their methodology, the countries that they cover, their data quality, and the frequency of update. And in the report that runs alongside this consultation, there's an appendix which gives you a lot of detail about the evaluation of these. In the end, we decided to use the ICP World Bank data. And this really provides the greatest coverage. But then it's not quite as simple as that, because there are 47 ICP World Bank PPIs. Again, we had to evaluate them and look and see which we thought would be the most useful for this framework. And we chose the World Bank GDP. And we chose that because it's broad in the economic factors covered, and because it covers more countries, 192 countries. There are a few points I'm going to make now about this data. The data we are using is 2017 data. And as we are all very aware, a lot has happened in the world since 2017. But we understand that the data will be updated this year, and then every 3 years thereafter. One of the comments, and very good question that has come up from people when we've been discussing this, is the issue that we're looking at data at a country level, but there are differences within countries. Some, countries have relatively wealthy parts of them, usually around cities, and less wealthy parts more often in the rural areas. There isn't a PPI available for regions within countries. So that is why we're working on the country level. Another thing to note about the PPIs is that they were developed for analysis. Their primary use is to compare economies between countries, and they weren't envisaged as a tool for comparative prices, differential pricing. So we just have to be mindful of that when we are discussing them. So I'm going to pause now for some questions. I would encourage you to use the Q&A, which I can see some of you already are, and we will ask Dave and Herman to answer those questions. And I can see already that we have a question from Elaine, and she says, are researchers authors from low GDP countries in favor of the framework, especially those who would have previously received, who pay the most APCs? Shouldn't we be heard? And it says that the webinar, it's disappeared. I don't know where that question's gone, but
I'm sure it went into the answered questions.
it's been answered. Brilliant. Okay.
Well,
so,
I am answering here and there some questions, but you can still see them in the answered questions.
Okay, super. We have a question from Toby, who says, you've mentioned that PPP is used in setting prices for medicines. Can you share some more examples? Herman, do we have any other examples?
Other examples for medicine, or
yes, other than where it's where they're used for differential pricing.
Well, actually, what we concluded is that we are one of the first that are actually using the PPIs in a way like this. It's mostly always just to have insights or to show how the differences are between countries, and there are not many industries or many other issues that have been handled making this data really actionable. So I think we are pretty much on the forefront here of something new.
While that is true for the data that we are using in this project, the pharmaceutical industry has worked with funders, for example, the Gates Foundation, to agree an international framework for discounting important drugs and pharmaceutical products to make sure that they are widely available around the world. And there's some reference to that in the report that accompanies the project.
Thanks, Alicia. And we have time for another one or two. There's one from Richard Geddy, who actually is just around the corner from me, so it's weird seeing him here. And he says, how relevant is a PPI for a specific developing country author if their research funding is coming from the Northern Hemisphere, e.g. Gates or Wellcome?
So I would say, Richard, that the customer here is not always the author. It is not always the author that is paying the APC. If a funder or institution is paying, of course, the geographic location of that organization would be relevant as well. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Make that clear in the report. It isn't.
Yes, and there's one other that I think we should have a look at, and it's from Alicia. And she says, the PPI used has more than a few outliers. Brazil, Argentina, Belize, Costa Rica, etc. are all in a bracket above payments for Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. This differs enormously from GNI per capita or economic classifications by World Bank, in which these Latin American countries are classified correctly as less advantaged. Why use this index, given it will decrease equity, I beg your pardon, Alicia, for Latin America? Herman, I think that you have given some thought to that question.
Yes, yes. Maybe let's first start why we chose the GDP one from the ICP World Bank data, because as you said, there were like 47 indices to choose from, and so they are the World Bank ICP data goes like quite deep in all kinds of verticals and products when it comes to PPIs, and we concluded ultimately that from the 47 there were like 11 really relevant, and this goes from some accumulated ones like GDP or domestic absorption to also one for education, for instances, and you would say that maybe a PPI that's specified for education would qualify much more. But if you look at education as one whole, the outliers were even much worse. And the thing is that you will always have outliers. So I'll go into that just shortly. But for instance, for the education outlier, there's very they always say there's an education strategy in Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand have really big outliers there. So when we went deeper, we even found more outliers. So we finally concluded that there was a short list of three PPIs of those 47 that were relevant, and GDP was one of them, and they actually didn't differ much from each other, and GDP had by far the most countries. But if you look at GDP, it's of course a total package of products and services. So when we evaluate it on a single on a single separate thing, it's always going to give some outliers based on one of the products or services in this basket that's exceptionally large. And of course, the first things that we heard when we published this is that why do we have like Bermuda and Barbados on the top? And these things they really happen because of the fact that they have like huge tourism industry that makes them even though they're a relative poor country, some richness around tourism is very concentrated and makes them really high. Yeah. We dove in those countries, and as you can imagine, the publication density is there in those countries is almost nil. So this is not a very big issue in this case. But also, of course, we dove into countries like that Alicia is mentioning in her comment, like Brazil and Argentina, and yeah, one of the things that's happening. Well, I can explain a little bit, and I can tell a little bit about the solution. The explanation is, of course, that natural resources in energy and agriculture are like really huge in those countries, and so they have quite high GDP per capita, even though there's a lot of inequality in those countries. But that's the reason why they end up relatively high. And then you can say, why use them? Well, like I said, we had to choose a PPI that's most relevant, that's most open, that's most covering all countries. And we'd rather see a way and find a way to deal with these outliers, as they call them. I wouldn't call Brazil and Argentina a real outlier, but they are quite high positioned. So one of the solutions is what Lorraine is going to talk about now in the next section, and that's the banding, because we don't want to give every country their own figure, because that's going to be much too large. So we have covered it in some bandings, and the bandings that banding that Lorraine is going to show you is not necessarily the banding that we are choosing. We are still working on that, because especially with this banding, we can make sure that the issue you are addressing around Brazil and Argentina is covered. So that they are in the same bracket as Poland, and that, for instance, China, which is also a subject that she's going to be talking about, is in a larger bracket. So I'm going to leave it at this and give Lorraine the bridge to the banding chapter.
Thank you, Herman. Well, we will move on. We might not have a chance to answer every question, but we will have a Q&A which will be available from the Coalition S webpage about this project. So any we don't cover off today, we will get back to. But mindful of time and that we've got quite a lot to get through, I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk. And we're going to talk about banding countries. Banding countries together into groups based on their PPI values. And this makes sense for a number of reasons. One, if you can imagine 200 different countries, each with its own price, would be an administration nightmare, very, very difficult, if not impossible to do. So banding countries into groups really helps with that. And we also mentioned that the PPIs are updated, and people also need stability, and they need to be able to plan going forward. Now, of course, you would still get change with banding, but not as much individual change as without it. So it really helps with that stability, the planning for the users of the services, but also for the publishers as well. There are some countries, just a few, which aren't covered by a PPI, and banding helps slot them in based on geography and other factors. And one of the main outliers, other than those you've already covered, is China. And banding does help to an extent with the outliers, and we'll look at that in more detail going forward. You've probably all seen this visual now, and this is an example of banding. And there's a couple of things I want to say before we look at it in any great detail. The first is, it is an example. We're not saying it's the way to do it, but we are putting it out there for discussion. And we have another illustration of banding to show you later on in the webinar. The second thing I want to make really clear is that this does not suggest for a moment that every country has to pay. Countries, of course, have waivers, and for example, in this example, you could see that all those in the band on the alpha band could continue having waivers. So we're not saying everybody has to pay by any means. The other thing is that we have shown you 4 bands in this example. Banding could be much more granular. As I say, this is an example, and in many cases, it might be more useful to have more granular banding, because there's quite this real range even within these bands here. In this banding example, you can see that China, which is one of the outliers that a number of people have mentioned to us, comes into this second band. And just the other thing to point out to you is that the USA is set as 1 in this ranking, and that is because we've made them the baseline at 1, because many publishers set their prices in US dollars. So even if they're not based in the US, often pricing is based in US dollars. So that's why they are set like that. So there are a number of things to consider when we are banding countries in groups like this. I know I just said it, but I'm going to repeat it because it comes up a lot. This approach would not replace the need for waivers, and it does not compel any publisher to charge in every country. So, for example, publishers could apply differential pricing to countries with a PPI above 0.4. If and where they do charge for publishing services, we believe the banding would help them do so more equitably. And I also want to point out that, of course, publishers do respond to countries when they're facing unexpected challenges and crises, and there is nothing here to suggest that they would not continue to do that, and I'm sure they would anyway. We think this banding could be used in practice in a number of ways. There is a lot of discussion everywhere at the moment about equity in scholarly publishing. And so we really hope that this will be a conversation starter. And indeed it seems to be, because so many of you are here joining in and sharing your views and thoughts with us. So it is an inspiration for publishers and other service providers in scholarly communication who wish to take a different approach. The framework could also be used by librarians and funders as a conversation starter about equitable global pricing. And also it could be a conversation starter about the contribution different countries would make to open infrastructure, such as diamond publishing platforms. As you'll see as we go through, the modelling we've done has been based on APCs, but of course you could use this sort of structure for other things, such as, I say, open infrastructure. It can also be used for transitioning existing services. And there are some things to note about transitioning. Actually, I'm sorry, I think I missed something I needed to say to you. Beg your pardon, I went too fast there. The thing I wanted to say first was, of course, this sort of framework can be used for new services, used by publishers or service providers to launch entirely new services with equitable pricing built in from the outset. And I can't imagine that anyone would want to not do that, to start out thinking about equity in a new service. And as we'll go on to transition existing services. And there often there's a lot of legacy things going on. So a really close dialogue between the stakeholders is needed to ensure that the framework is deployed in ways that work well for the customers and that it really does advance equity. When we talk about transitioning existing services, we need to be mindful that lowering prices in some places may mean publishers raise prices in other places if they wish to ensure their revenue remains neutral. Now, our analysis indicated on average and without banding, the list price APCs would need to increase on average by 39% across all publishers if they are to retain their current revenues. When we talk to librarians and library consortia about this, they all thought that the PPI allocation was fair. but that they would find getting additional money to pay higher prices difficult, if not impossible. So we did some modeling looking at how the bands could be weighted. And I'm just going to talk through this table. Again, you'll find this in the report, and it gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. So in the first row, base case, no banding, we looked at all the outputs in 2022 for open access journals only. This didn't include hybrid journals. And we assumed an APC of $1,000 US. And we also looked at where waivers are usually applied. And across all the publishers, we got that figure of 39%, the uplift that would be needed if the PPI was applied with no banding. We then drilled down and we looked at 4 publishers in more detail. So those are those columns, publisher 1 to publisher 4. And you can see there's quite a difference between them when we applied that modeling and those assumptions. And this reflects the different places in the world where papers are coming from to those particular publishers. Then we looked at the banding and the weighting of the bands, and you can see application of that mitigates this to a degree, not completely, but to quite a degree, and reduces the uplift that would be needed. Now, when we did that work, when we did that modeling, we created a tool, the fairer pricing tool, and we are sharing it with everybody to enable publishers to use it, to develop their own pricing framework, and of course to put in their own real data so that they can see how it would work out for them. A couple of the publishers that I've spoken to have mentioned that they think the 39% is in fact overstated, and they said that they provide more waivers and more discounts already than is evident from the list price APC. So of course there's lots of things going on behind the scenes that we couldn't possibly know about. So if publishers use the tool, they will be able to do that with their real live data and see how it plays out for them. The other thing I would say, if you are going to download the tool and use it, we made it in Excel so that you can see all the formula, all the structure that we have used, so that it's absolutely open and transparent, and you can see how it works. So clearly a close dialogue between stakeholders is really necessary when we start to look at a fairer pricing framework, and to make sure it works for customers and to make sure that it advances equity. And we recognize there are some tensions. I've been talking about the weighting of the bands and so on. There are tensions between the simplicity and transparency and tweaking bands, and particularly with an eye to generating a more acceptable result. This framework could enable publishers. Oh, yeah, sorry. I just want to say, a question that we have been asked, is that surely this framework would enable publishers to increase their customer base. And of course, that is the whole point. The whole point of a framework like this is to make participation in open access more accessible to everybody, and that the publishers receive more submissions from researchers in countries around the world. In our modeling, we didn't model in that assumption, but we would sincerely hope it was the case. However, we think the expansion would not plug the potential shortfall completely, and certainly not in the short term. I thought I'd just mention that because it does come up quite a bit. One of the outliers, we talked about a few countries already today, but what I want to focus on a bit is China, because really most of the publishers we have spoken to have outlined China as a problem because it has a relatively low PPI at 0.62, but the largest output of journal articles. And as we said earlier, we're working on a country level. The PPI is a country-wide metric, and so it takes into account both those highly industrialized and research-intensive centers in a country and the more rural areas. Now, one response to the issue of China, particularly in the context of banding, would be to introduce differential pricing for countries with a PPI of less than 0.62 in the highest band. But that would really be to disadvantage some countries, for example, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Slovenia, and so on. However, when there are multiple entries for one country, we can take the larger one, and that would put China and Macau at the figure of Hong Kong, which is 0.77. And I'm just going to show you how that plays out. As you can see here, this is another banding illustration. In this illustration, we have 4 bands, as the previous example. But you can see China is now here in the delta band because we've taken the higher factor and it's at the same level as Hong Kong. So that is perhaps something that we could discuss. Obviously, that needs careful discussion, but might be something that we want to talk about in the context of this framework. But I'm going to pause now. I'm aware of the time and we've got quite a bit to do, but if you've got any questions about the banding, please do put them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to answer them. I can't actually see.
There have been a lot of questions, Lorraine, while you've been presenting about the approach and about PPIs in general, about the World Bank income classifications into higher, middle, and lower income bands. But there haven't been any specific questions about this banding, other than, I wonder if it would be worth, Dave, inviting you in to reiterate the point that you made in the Q&A, I believe in response to a question from Alicia.
Yes, the question was, sorry, I'll see if I can find the question now.
It's here. The proposal predicts the implementation will increase APCs by 39%. This means authors in Brazil, Argentina, Belize, Portugal, Spain, and Italy will pay 110% of what they pay now.
Okay, so that's the point. The idea of the banding, I mean, it has various advantages, but one of the big things that you get out of banding is the ability to deal with that 39% and make it lower. And the table that we showed earlier in the presentation showed the outcomes both globally and for several specific publishers of choosing your banding carefully. And if you choose your banding carefully, you can reduce that 39% down to, well, I mean, some of the figures in the table like 5 or 6%, at which point, if you're offering a 20% discount and you're increasing the base by 6%, the people in those countries will benefit. It's not really in anyone's interest to put up the price overall for people who need it.
Yeah, Glenn has just asked a question about the devaluation of a country's currency. And I think in our next session, we'll be dealing with that a little bit more. So we'll pick that up then, if that's okay, Glenn.
Yeah, to shortly add to what Dave is saying and to the question of Alicia, like Dave is saying, the whole banding is designed or to get this 39% down. And the other thing you just handled was the China issue. If you want, I can go deeper in that. But if China, if we introduce the business rule that if there are multiple entries for a country, that we take the highest one, and in terms of China, that would be putting it at Hong Kong. Then this is already solving a very large impact on the overall plus 39 that we're talking about. So as Dave indicates, it can go down like to plus 10 or plus 20 or even lower. And at that point, with Brazil and Argentina in a lower bracket than China at that moment, they will absolutely see a 10 or 20% reduction in their price.
Thank you, Herman. I'm going to move us on now to talk about exchange rates and risk sharing. And this sort of goes into the question that Glenn raised. And one of the things we were asked to look at as part of this project was this whole issue of exchange rates. And some of the countries that we've spoken to that have currencies that fluctuate greatly have really severe problems because they are paying probably about 95% or so of the money they spend on scholarly communications, not in their own currency, but in dollars or euro or sterling. And prices are set, as we know, usually annually, and they might feel comfortable with them. But when it comes to paying, of course, that can be a real problem because of the fluctuations in their currencies. So for that reason, we had to think about how that could be mitigated and how the risk could be shared differently. This is quite complicated and we haven't got a great deal of time, but I will try and talk us through it. So the idea is that the publisher sets their global prices formed by PPP in their normal currency. And then at that point, the prices are translated into local currencies using the then current exchange rate. In the case of some countries, if the currency is very unstable, you might want to take a 3-month or even a 6-month average rather than the rate on the day. Those fixed prices would be published and transparent, and the publisher would issue invoices to the customer at the fixed price. That could be in dollars or it could be in the local currency, and the customers invoiced in dollars would bear the cost of any currency exchange. Customers invoiced in the local currency, I beg your pardon. Customers invoiced in the local currency would convert the amount into dollars for payment. And the publisher would be, in effect, bearing the risk that the exchange rate has changed between the price setting and the actual time of the payment. There are some challenges to this approach. Clearly, it is more complex to implement for publishers. And clearly, there are some administration challenges in doing this. And it might be unreasonable to expect this of smaller publishers. And indeed, all publishers might be concerned about losing existing revenue due to exchange fluctuations. And that is understandable. And therefore, we also did some modeling to try and quantify. Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. We did some modeling to try and quantify what those risks were. And this is modeling again that you, sorry, I don't know what's happening. This is modeling that you can do using the tool. So we looked at the exchange rates year by year from 2013 to 2021 and weighted each currency by the number of 2,022 publications per country, and summed the totals across each band. And we found that across all publishers, there would be an annual fluctuations in the overall income of up to minus 2.5% if applied to all countries, with a PPI up to 0.6. Of course, the actual figures would vary by publisher depending on the geographical spread of papers and the banding they adopted. But as I say, this is something that publishers can use the tool we made to calculate for themselves. Right, sorry about I don't know what happened with the slides flying about there, but we really are now at the pause for questions about the currency and the exchange rates. So are there any questions in the chat?
So Lorraine, we had Glenn's question earlier. Sorry, while you've been speaking, I've been replying to some comments. So Glenn asked, will the rate of devaluation of a country's currency in a 6-month period be considered when assigning APCs? That's quite a short period. But he does note that countries such as South Africa can have very volatile exchange rates. So have you addressed that specifically? Or might Herman or Dave comment on this?
The exact exchange rate to be used when setting the price will be up to the publisher, but we kind of assumed that they would take a 6-month average up to the point of, or something like a 6-month average up to the point where the price is set, rather than a point figure, because that makes more sense. But it could be 3 months or it could be a year.
So the answer to Glenn's question is that unless a publisher reviewed their prices every 3 or 6 months, that rate of volatility would not be addressed.
Correct.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, when you say it wouldn't be addressed, the price will be set in the local currency for the whole of the following year. This is the principle. So you set your prices in September, you figure out what exchange rate you're going to use for that price, which is probably based on how the exchange rate has been for the past 6 months or so. And then that price then applies from January through to December the following year.
Thanks, Dave. That's helpful.
And Dave, you did quite some analysis on the whole fluctuation in multiple countries, right? And
there's quite a lot in the paper about this.
Yeah,
it goes into the weeds a bit, and I don't want to do that here. But
yeah, absolutely. But just wanted to address that.
Yes.
Right, well, we're doing very well for time, actually, and we've got time for more questions about the exchange rate, or if anyone wants to go back, since we've got a bit of time. We have a question from Toby. He says that Brill and De Gruyter announced their merger today. Another example of publishers going for scale, which is what's going to be needed if complex pricing models are to take root in the market. Well, I think that's a comment, really, but thank you, Toby, for that comment. Any other points you would like our experts to answer? Alicia again is saying, asking, is there any chance that Coalition S will consider using a different index? Why are you so set on this clearly inadequate one? I don't understand why this particular PPI is unchangeable, except of course for the fact that it protects poorer countries within Plan S, but not those of us in Latin America. Why do you insist on this specific PPI? There is no justification for this. Well, Alicia, I think that's a really, really good question, and I'm glad that you have raised it. I don't think Coalition S is promoting any particular index. I mean, this is the one that we used in this project. I can see Johan is nodding there. Nobody's saying that is the one. I think the thing is, and the really important thing is, as I said at the beginning.
Yes, I mean, Yeah.
Sorry, Johan.
Yeah, if I may just for
Of course you may.
this is not policy and this is not our policy, this is not our proposal. I would like to insist that this is the proposal by Information Power. It is one proposal. It can be complemented by other proposals that then can be compared. I mean, this is the big, as I said, this is the beginning of a conversation. I mean, if other people want to do the same exercise with different indicators, I think that would be very, very welcome to enrich the discussion. I would like to insist on that. But Lorraine, I give the floor back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Johan. That was a really good point. And absolutely, I mean, I think it would be great to see some other examples. I mean, I think what we have tried to do, and as Haman said, is to make sure that we're using an index which is open, so that we're using open data so everyone can see you know, how those numbers got there. But certainly I think we'd be really happy to see other examples and would welcome them. Brilliant. So I don't think we have any more questions, do we, Alicia? No. Okay, so that brings us very nicely then to talk about the next steps. And as Johan said right at the beginning, this isn't policy, this is really about developing a discussion, really talking about how we deal with equity and the steps that we can take. There is a lot of detail in the report that we have made available behind the work that I've shown you today. And there is also a survey as well. And we would really encourage everyone to submit their thoughts and to answer the questions in that survey. And I know that Coalition S really hope that everyone will take a part and that we really start to have that discussion and talk about this, because it's not an easy problem to solve. And we need that dialogue and we need the discussion to really take it forward. So your feedback will be really important in informing the approach that we are showing here in the fairer pricing framework and the tool. The report and the tool and the survey you can reach through the QR code that is on the screen here. You should have links to all those in the email that you received with the invitation. But if you can't find that, as I say, do use the QR code and it will take you to those documents and to the survey. And we would really encourage you as well to share those links with your colleagues, with your community, to get as much feedback as possible so that we can yes, really develop that discussion. So I think, Johan, over to you for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Lorraine. Closing remarks. Yes, I mean, I was very happy to have this discussion. Also, even if some questions were, you know, probing and challenging. But as I said, this is the beginning of a conversation. I really think, you know, the choices that you have made are yours to make, I believe. I mean, you know, we found out this work to you, and you made considered choices that were yours to make. We take note of those conclusions, but I think we should make a difference between the work that we commissioned and the work that you carried out. I think that's perhaps important for Alicia's questions. Again, this is not a policy; it is a proposal that can be complemented with other proposals. Basically, what we are doing here is opening the discussion. And as with any discussion that you open, there's many questions, many justified questions. I think Alicia's questions are very well considered and important to consider. They have also come up with some other people. We should definitely address those, but we should address those as a community. It does not make sense to ask Coalition S to carry out all of these studies going forward. I think it's for somebody else now to take up the torch and carry it further, and we will certainly also be glad to host such discussions in the future. So this is not meant as an apology; it's just meant as contextualization of the proposal and the discussion. I was very happy to see that there was good engagement here, and I certainly look forward to further discussion in this important area in the future. Thank you very much, everyone. And back to you, Lorraine or Alicia, if you want to have some other closing remarks on your side.
Nothing else from me, colleagues. Any other words, thoughts?
I would just thank you, Lorraine, for presenting. There have been some very nice
Yes.
comments in the
Alicia.
chat about the presentation and the information.
Yes, I think it was a rewarding discussion, and we should definitely continue this at some later time. Thanks a lot, Lorraine, Alicia, Herman, and Dave for answering the questions and for being here today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.